all of you for being here to come in and listen to my story and what it is that I have to say. So I'm actually going to start with a little bit of a slide presentation. If we could just cut the light for a sec. I think it's over. I hope that's it. Oh, maybe not. You can see, everybody can see, right? Okay. I was trained as an ethnomusicologist. An ethno who? An ethnomusicologist. I study ethnic people. Aren't you an ethnic people? To Western eyes, I guess I am. So why do you study what you are? So no one can tell me who I be. Because people try to tell you who you are. When people try to tell you who you are, they inevitably get it wrong. They don't tell you who you are, but who they want you to be. In 2014, after having spent the better part of 12 years in academia, I quietly resigned my position as an assistant professor of music history and cultures at Syracuse University. I had been living in Syracuse for 2 years, and the city did not seem conducive to the psychological well-being of a young Black woman with no familial ties to the place. My dissatisfaction with the city was perhaps only surpassed by my dissatisfaction with my academic field, ethnomusicology, in particular, and to a certain extent, academia as a whole. The musicological canon was still overly Eurocentric, even in my field, where non-Western people historically have been overrepresented as subjects and objects of study. And perhaps worse, these subjects have been overwhelmingly researched and represented by researchers from outside of their culture. As a minority researcher, I saw little that validated my forms of knowledge, my experiences, my ways of being. I had become disillusioned with the system, and I could feel fatigue setting in. Academia had become a game that I no longer wanted to play, at least not under the current terms. It was time for me to go. And so I moved to New Orleans and started a small publishing and production company called My People Tell Stories, LLC. After all, my most significant education had come through the stories that I had learned growing up. And I noticed that in my classes, students most connected with material that had a personal component to it, one that allowed them to think about the world of another and simultaneously reflect on their own. Consequently, for the company's first publication, I set out to write a retelling of my dissertation research on parang music in Trinidad. However, the book had other ideas. Follow the Yellow Brick Road was my mother's suggestion to me when I told her that the book kept morphing. I heeded her advice and decided to see where this literary journey would take me. Then, on a rather unassuming day, while visiting home and running errands with my mom in Brooklyn, I thought to myself, ethnographic memoir, that's the type of story that I'm writing. However, this was not the kind of ethnographic memoir that involved non-native researchers writing reflexive pieces about their fieldwork in a culturally foreign land. As stated in the book's title, this was an ethnography of home, a story written from a place of familiarity about places that were crucial to my development during my formative years. As I began doing some research on ethnographic memoirs, I came across a scholar by the name of Swami Anand Prahlad, who wrote an article in the Journal of American Folklore about his pending project, Getting Happy, an ethnographic memoir. Prahlad's decision to write an ethnographic memoir was, quote, driven by personal crises arising from the schizophrenia so common among first-generation and minority academicians. As many have noted, this fragmentation of self results from spending so many waking hours in an environment hostile to one's most authentic being, an environment in which the Eurocentric imperialist mind stands guard over the bees of the hive with a cruel intensity equal to that of plantation overseers. In this case, though, control is enforced through polite, intellectual means rather than the physical, a kind of control in which the class, race, and personal aesthetics and sensibilities of the institution clash so profoundly with one's own that a resulting psychological quandary is inevitable. This project reflects an effort to recover the parts of myself scattered about like bloody bodies on a field of war after battle, to nourish them back to health and to reintegrate them into whole based not on imperatives handed down by societal institutions, but on that disclaimed shadow that haunts the halls of Western power, the inner spiritual voice, end quote. In relatively few words, Prahlad aptly captures the reasons for my departure from academia and my decision to write an ethnographic memoir. To say that writing this book served as a sort of therapy for me would be an understatement. Yet it was not the kind of project that allowed me to effortlessly abandon the norms of the discipline in which I had been enmeshed for several years. I fought myself the entire way. I was, and still am, fighting an ideology of colonialism and imperialism that is so entrenched in our culture and really across the globe that it is not easily discarded. At times, one has to be hypervigilant to detect its presence. Through this project, I was trying to retrieve myself from years of Western education that threatened to promote cultural amnesia. I was trying to decolonize myself before there was nothing left to colonize. There was an urgency to complete this project that was rooted in a certain terror that one feels when one's very existence is threatened. I had to prove to myself that I exist, and not because someone else had given me permission to exist. East of Flatbush, North of Love is a labor of love, an ode to my family and to my culture. My story is neither highly theoretical nor groundbreaking. It is a simple story of growing up in the West Indian enclave of East Flatbush, Brooklyn. This is not to say that there isn't a serious element that runs throughout. For all its simplicity, it is nonetheless a form of protest. By rejecting conventional ways of writing, I seek to reject conventional ways of thinking. The book calls into question how knowledge is produced and whose knowledge is privileged. Most importantly, it is a way to acknowledge that my people's stories are just as valid as the stories that others tell about us. This is a project about reclaiming power, dignity, and humanity. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water. In one of her most often stated quotes, Toni Morrison once said, "You know, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for houses and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places. Floods is the word they use. But in fact, it is not flooding, it is remembering. Remembering where it used to be. All water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. Writers are like that. Like water, I remember where I was before I was straightened out," end quote. I think this quote is stated so often because it is a powerful statement, a metaphor for something I believe most people are struggling to do. Remember who they were before they were straightened out. In the context of the African diaspora, for generations, people of African descent were forced or coerced into forgetting who they were, their histories, their songs, their sacred beliefs, their entire ways of being. The sting of the whip in them dogs, as the mighty sparrow might say, ensured that the enslaved were kept in their place. Forgetting their own humanity was a way to endure, a way to survive captivity. But as Toni Morrison suggests, just like a river that floods, we do not truly forget who we are. And when we remember ourselves, we are a force to be reckoned with. In many ways, for me, the process of writing East of Flatbush, North of Love was an attempt to remember who I was before the world, and particularly the halls of academia, attempted to straighten me out. It was me remembering that the histories that I was taught throughout school didn't adequately reflect my story, my remembrances, which begin in East Flatbush. So before I was allowed to forget, I put pen to paper to tell my story. I literally decided to write myself and my people into history. So before I kind of go further into the book, just a few things. One, I have a cold, so I'm sorry, it just happened. So I'm a little stuffy, but I'm gonna do my best. You know, if you see me sniffling a little bit, you know why. I also just wanted to make a few comments about the book. One of the things that I wanted to do was create a book that was not heavy with academic jargon. I wanted it to be a book that was informative, that was research-based, but that was also something that anyone on the street could pick up and read, right? And so I do have footnotes. That's the academic in me. So there are a lot of footnotes in the book. I couldn't completely get rid of that. So there are a lot of footnotes in the book, and I'm going to read passages from the book, but I'm not going to read the footnotes. But just know that there are parts that would have footnotes attached to. Also, the other thing is that music really is a central focus of the book. And so not only do I include lyrics within the actual writing of the piece, there are over 100 songs that are listed in the book as a sort of soundtrack. So when you get to certain sections, there might be a cue to listen to a particular song or a particular set of songs that you can listen to before, during, or after that section. But it goes with the section, and it's just there to kind of help, inform the topic that I'm talking about in that section. So I just wanted to let you guys know those few things before I get started with the book. And you'll see me take a few swigs of water every now and again also. So the next section that I'm going to read from is really from chapter 1, from the beginning. And this is just a short section, but I want to kind of set the stage for the book. So this is chapter 1, One Family, East Flatbush. Mom always says you should be proud of where you're from. Because of this, I never liked when I'd ask someone where they're from and they would say, a little town outside of enter some major city. How is anyone going to know that your little town exists, that your people exist, if you don't put it and them on the map? Q, Pretty Boy by Prophet Benjamin. Your hair looked just like my own, he said, approaching me as I waited impatiently for the B-44 to arrive. The other bodies at the bus stop appeared content in their boredom, but this gentleman could not let the time pass without bugging some unsuspecting soul, me, for a bit of conversation. I looked at his long, unstylized, matted locks. He had some real Rastaman dreads, boy. He was well over 6 feet, and his locks hung past his waist. He must have been growing them for a long time, because the ends, some of which were on the verge of dropping off, were a shade of brown far removed from the gray roots that sprung from his scalp. I had to chuckle. His hair was a far cry from the two-stranded twist that adorned my head. Granted, there was nothing fancy about my hairdo. I was on my way to teach a piano lesson, not a wedding. Yet I couldn't help but think to myself, my hair does not look like yours. I don't remember what I actually said to him, but it was something more polite. He then asked, Trini? I said, yeah, born here, but Trini background. How'd you know? I could hear it when you talk. He wasn't Trini, but I couldn't quite place the accent. Them small island accents can be tricky. Before I could ask him where he was from, the bus pulled up to the corner. We weren't in a hurry to get on, so we let the more impatient ones make their way to the front of the house, to the front of the bus. By the time we had gotten on, there weren't any more seats, so we continued our conversation, standing amongst the other Caribbean bodies on board. As he towered over my 5-foot 4-inch frame, he told me he was from Grenada, but that he had lived in Trinidad for several years, so he was quite adept at picking up a Trini accent. Honestly, I don't remember much else about that conversation, but we continued making chit-chat until he got off of the bus a few minutes later. I stayed on. I was going all the way to Bushwick. Bushwick was a long pull from where I'd begun my encounter with the Grenadian Rastaman. We'd met at the corner of New York Avenue and Avenue D in East Flatbush, a Caribbean outpost literally in the middle of Brooklyn. Growing up, people here were mostly from various parts of the English-speaking Caribbean. Like Rastaman so astutely ascertained, my family is from the Twin Island Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, but others, like him, hail from elsewhere in the Caribbean, including Jamaica, Barbados, St. Vincent, and Grenada. There are folks from the mainland too, immigrants from Guyana, and some Central Americans, primarily from Panama. If you live here and you're not a first or second generation immigrant, you're an anomaly. So that's just a little bit, and that chapter in general really sets the scene and talks more about East Flatbush and what it's like growing up as a Caribbean person in East Flatbush. But one of the reasons why I have so much pride in where I'm from is because of my mother. And I'll talk a little bit more about her first. But this is one of the songs that I heard very often growing up. Trinidad is my land, and of it I am proud and glad. But I can't understand why some people just talking bad. But I know all of them, they're running their mouth. Don't know what they're talking about. They would paint you black every day, and the right things they would never say. Like our sportsmen being rated among the best. Our scholars have sit and pass every test and put us right alongside the rest. But then our pitch lake is the greatest one of its kind. Our sugar and oil is really refined. So you see, friends, this is a real King Solomon's mind. The song has more verses, but I'm not going to sing all of them. And my mother never sung an entire song. She would always sing bits and pieces of songs. And so, you know, I can't remember actually the first time that I heard that song. It's called Portrait of Trinidad by the Mighty Sniper. But I'm pretty sure that the first person who sung it to me was my mother. That I'm almost positive of. And it was a song that she would pull out of her arsenal anytime someone would bad talk her country or deny her people credit for some accomplishment or achievement. And a significant portion of my childhood was spent with my mother using songs, mostly but not exclusively calypsos, to teach me about history, about politics, about socioeconomic conditions, and more. And I think it's really perhaps those early lessons of my mom using songs as a teaching device that's partly responsible for me eventually studying ethnomusicology. However, as I stated in the preface to my book, ethnomusicology and academia in general presented me with its own set of challenges. Despite the fact that people of color have been the primary subjects of ethnomusicological inquiry, we have been all but invisible as researchers, meaning that our stories are often not told by us. And so what, you know, some people may say, you know, there's been this debate throughout academia, but, you know, some people say people shouldn't write about themselves anyway. You know, they're too close to the subject matter. And that may or may not be true depending on the individual, but then I would also counter with that, is it better to have people written primarily about by people who are not from that culture? So you do have two sides of the coin, and we can talk about this, I guess, a little bit more with the question and answer section. I think there's always something that other people can bring to the table. So if someone is not from a particular culture, there's always something that they can maybe see that people within that culture are not seeing. But there's a lot of danger that's done, and a lot of what people might call epistemic violence or ontological violence that's done when people are only understanding themselves by what other people tell them. So again, that's something we could talk about a little bit later. But there's an African proverb that speaks to this, and you hear different variations of it. But it says, one of them is that until the lion has its own historian, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And the tagline for my business is, if you're not telling your own stories, someone else is telling them for you. A case in point, in East Flatbush, north of Love, I write about an instance that illustrates how differently two people can interpret history. And this again goes to the reasons why you shouldn't have, why you need multiple interpretations of single events. Q, Slave by the Mighty Sparrow. I'm a slave from a land so far. I was caught and I was brought here from Africa. I'm a slave from a land so far. I was caught and I was brought here from Africa. Well, it was licks like fire from the white slave master every day. I down on my knees. Weeks and weeks until we crossed the seas to reach in the West Indies. And then he made me work. I said I work, good Lord, no pay. I toil, I toil, I toil, I toil. I said I toil hard each day, and I'm dying, and I'm crying. Oh, 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 good Lord, I want to be free. question of whose story gets told is an important one, and one that has been afflicting people throughout the Americas since Columbus's first voyage. Imagine my horror when encountering the following situation while attending a pre-wedding event for a friend's upcoming nuptials. The grandmother of the groom lived in a quaint house in New England that was about as old as the nation. It was beautiful and exuded historical charm. At some point in the evening, the elderly owner of the house, who I believe had had too much to drink, approached me and said something to this effect. Our family had slaves, and they liked us so much that they stayed with us even after slavery ended. One of the other attendees, a young white woman with blonde hair and blue eyes no less, looked like she was going to explode with rage. Better her than me. It's the angry black woman syndrome, so I didn't want to go there. She said, clearly upset, the young woman apologized for the unnecessary and untimely words of the homeowner. The homeowner's granddaughter, who seemed to only catch part of my interaction with her grandmother, replied, I'm not sure exactly what was said, but I apologize. I didn't engage grandma in debate. I didn't challenge her statement. As I say in the book, I don't believe you can teach old dogs new tricks, and sometimes you have to pick your battles. But her belief that the emancipated slaves that her family had once owned stayed in the house of their oppressors because they were good people made me chuckle inside, if only to suppress sadness. Yet her belief is not a solitary one. This was not the first time that I had heard the notion of newly emancipated slaves living with their former masters as an indication of good relations between the two groups, as opposed to a survival strategy on the part of the formerly enslaved. And I can only think of the mighty sparrows singing of the plight of many following emancipation. I was then put out on the street. I had no clothes, I had no food, and no place to sleep. I had no education, no particular ambition. This I cannot conceal. Forgot my native culture, lived like a vulture. From the white man I had to steal. Because he made me work, I said I worked. Good Lord, no pay. I toil hard each day, and I'm dying. And I'm crying. What Sparrow's song might encourage someone to consider is that many former slaves would not refuse to continue living in the homes of their masters, especially if the alternative was to try and survive without basic needs. So while some left the plantation, others remained, as that choice represented their best mode of survival. And it is plausible that emancipated slaves had a good enough relationship with their owners to warrant staying with them. I can buy that. However, if the terms slave and owner were replaced with the words captive and kidnapper, we would call that situation Stockholm Syndrome. By asserting and privileging a narrative that posits that living with former slave masters was an indication of good relations between enslaved and master, we are presenting a rose-colored view of the aftermath of slavery that not only de-emphasizes the brutality of slavery and its psychological effects, but actually humanizes the slave master while dehumanizing the formerly enslaved. Former slave masters, and by extension their descendants, are humanized in the sense that they are permitted to have a range of human attitudes and experiences. They can enslave and terrorize a group of people, yet still be considered kind and caring individuals on some level. On the other hand, the formerly enslaved, and by extension their descendants, are not afforded that opportunity. After enduring generations of slavery, they were expected to continue working side by side with their oppressors without feelings of disgust, distrust, and disaffection for those who had not only kept them and their ancestors in captivity for generations, but also continued to oppress them in the post-emancipation era. In our society, only animals are expected to be held hostage and remain loyal to their captors. I often like to start classes or workshops that I do with a prompt. When I think of X, I think of Y. So a lot of times if I'm doing a class on the Caribbean, I'll start off very generally. When I think of the Caribbean, I think of what? And ask for a response. So I'll do a little one with you here. When I think of steel pan, I think of, let me put my glasses on so I can see you. Don't all go all at once. When I think of steel pan, I think of, if you don't know what steel pan is, then you're out. Or steel drums, people say steel drums here. When I think of steel pan, steel drums, I think of, ooh, me, oh, this. Think of reggae. When I think of steel pan, steel drums, I think of jerk chicken. When I think of steel pan, steel drums, I think of one more, and then I'll put you out of your misery. You think of? Caribbean. Okay, so we've got reggae, we've got jerk chicken, we've got Caribbean. Who said reggae? You said reggae. Who said jerk chicken? I'll get to that afterwards. No, but there's a reason why I do this, and I'll keep going, and then I'll get back to it. So in the book, I write that when I think of the Caribbean exercise, my students can, quote, rattle off a list of countries, food, and music genres associated with the Caribbean. However, I'm never surprised, and I'm always disappointed that my students never have much to say about the history of the Caribbean, and even less about its literature. And I didn't ask you about that, I asked you very specifically about steel pan. But much of East Flatbush, north of Love, is a reaction to what Belinda Edmondson would call a romanticized view of the Caribbean. A Caribbean that is thought of as a tourist paradise where people are eternally happy. In his book, Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History, anthropologist Michelle Roth-Trio states that, quote, most Europeans and North Americans learn their first history lessons through media that have not been subjected to the standards set by peer reviews, university presses, or doctoral committees, end quote. As a result, for many living outside of the region, the word Caribbean evokes images of white sandy beaches, the sound of steel drums, and the smiling faces of locals. People think of reggae and Bob Marley, and of Harry Belafonte and the Banana Boat song. The Caribbean is treated as a utopia, with little thought given to the continued effects of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism in the region and beyond. On the other hand, there are those who would wish to erase or minimize slavery and its legacy in effort to ease their conscience, as perhaps was the case with Grandma. When I think of the steel pan, I think of more than just island fun in the sun. As Calypsonian Denise Plummerwood sang, I see a people creative who must overcome, make magic from old steel, from rusty old drum. But I also see the struggle of those early pan men, a story that is also part of my history. Q, The Road by Lord Kitchener, Outcast by Mighty Sparrow, Pan in A minor by Lord Kitchener, Pan in A minor by Renegade Steel Orchestra, The Hammer by David Rudder, Calling Me, Destra Garcia. Like I said before, my grandmother and her sisters were from a part of town that didn't have the best reputation. Steel bands were a fixture in Eastport of Spain, where those badjans, pan men, would get into musical battles and physical ones too. They had a penchant for fighting with each other and with the authorities who would try to seize and destroy their pans. These men and the women who accompanied them were considered ruffians, hooligans, thugs, the scourge of the island. They were so bad that Sparrow wrote a song about them. Mom would always sing a few choice lines. Society in Trinidad for a steel band man was just as hard or even harder than that. For any calypsonian, don't mind how you're talented, you had to go outside. No appreciation here, society had too much false pride. Calypsonian really catch hell for a long time. To associate yourself with them was a big crime. And if your sister talk with a steel band man, the family want to break she hand, put she out, lick out every teeth in she mouth, pass you out, cast. By the time I was born, the steel bands had lost their violent reputation. Any battles between the bands were purely of a musical nature. Nonetheless, the history of the steel bands has been etched in my brain. Songs that my mother sang to me, like The Outcast, The Road, and others, spoke of the history of pan. As I write in the book, when I think of the Caribbean, I think of the steel pan and how those pan men were once outcasts in their own country, and how their journey toward respectability came in part because of their acceptance abroad in Europe and America. For me, steel pan does not symbolize a tourist paradise. It symbolizes an ingenuity that flew in the face of oppression, the oppression of a group of people, of oppression of their way of life, and of their very ways of being, and their ways of being. It represents how from a ban on drumming emerged the tambour bamboo and eventually the magic hidden within a rusty old drum. It symbolizes overcoming the notion that a worthless colonized people could never amount to anything, never do anything with purpose. Steel pan is colonialism, imperialism, poverty, and crime alchemized into love. Many, many, many years it took. Now we have found the natural look. Many, many, many years it took us to find the natural look. Suddenly, out of the blue, this thing has struck like something new. Everybody, young and old, growing afro and telling the world, Black is beautiful, Black is beautiful. Lift your head like me, you got to wear me color with dignity. Black is beautiful and I'm Black. See, I'm Black and proud. It's high time that we get rid of that old slave mentality. Black is Beautiful is another one of those songs that I heard my mother sing a lot. And listening to the lyrics, and I just only did that first verse, you could think that we were talking about this day and age. But this was a song that my mother learned when she was young. But again, many similarities between this time and the 70s when there was Black Power in Trinidad, which we talk about a little bit after. My mother used to use songs to teach me about prejudice and bias, not just with respect to Panman and Calypsonians, but also racism and prejudice based on color, as evident in this section titled Race and Ethnicity. Q, Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, James Brown. Q, Black is Beautiful, by the Mighty Duke. Q, Split Me in Two, by the Mighty Dougla. Q, African, by Brother Superior. That's why you so Black. The words flowed out of her mouth with the assuredness of a girl who just knew she had had the last word. Although I witnessed the event, I'm not even sure who Natalie was arguing with or why. I do know I remember the bitterness with which she hurled that insult at another classmate. The words Natalie said that day, they stung my ears, they still do. And I talked about this a little bit before, but I was in 4th grade, so about 8 years old when this happened. If that wasn't bad enough, I was enveloped by a wave of embarrassment when a white woman, one of the school aides, stopped Natalie to explain to her the inappropriateness of what she had said. Although I have always been grateful to that woman for having the moral fiber to stop this child and teach her that her actions were wrong, I have never felt good about a white woman having to tell a Black child not to spew racial venom towards another Black child. However, the legacy of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism in the Americas and elsewhere did not just influence Black-white relations. It continuously affects interactions among people from and descended from Africa and Asia, the ways in which they perceive themselves and the ways in which they're perceived by others. You're pretty for a dark-skinned girl. He's so Black and ugly. She thinks she's all that because she's light-skinned. And on and on and on. I've heard it all. Friends who since childhood have been made to feel inferior because of their dark skin tone and kinky hair. Other friends who were ostracized because their adolescent peers didn't want to be friends with a probably stuck-up girl with light skin and good hair. Thankfully, I haven't internalized negative perceptions of others based on color, at least not to that extent. As I like to say, I'm an equal opportunity hater. But perhaps that's because my parents never used skin color as the basis for an insult and or not liking someone. Maybe that's because many of the women in my immediate family are dark-skinned, including my mom, grandma, and Auntie Ruby. And we already know my mom thinks she's hot stuff. I talk about her a lot in the book. Maybe it's because in our home in Brooklyn, race and ethnicity were freely discussed in conversations about prejudice, racism, and self-hatred. Racial prejudice and colorism are facets of life in Trinidad too. a country where the majority of the population consists of people descended from Africa and Asia. Again, you'll find these issues virtually anywhere colonialism and imperialism reared its head. And again, Mom would have songs appropriate to the discussion. She had the perfect song for depicting some of the racial tensions that had emerged in Trinidad, where British colonialism resulted in Africans and Asians living side by side and eventually having mixed-race children known locally as Douglas or Douglas. Mom would sing the chorus of Split Me in Two, a song by the mighty Douglas, who, as evident by his name, is of mixed African and Indian descent. In this song, the mighty Douglas humorously describes the plight of being a Douglas in Trinidad. The song opens with a hypothetical situation. Let us suppose they pass a law. They don't want people living here anymore. Let us suppose they pass a law. They don't want people living here anymore. Everybody got to find their country according to their race originally. What a confusion I would cause in the place. They might have to shoot me in space because they're sending Indians to India and the Negroes back to Africa. Can somebody please just tell me where to send and pour me? I am neither one nor the other. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. If they're serious about sending back people for true, they're bound to split me in two. The mighty Douglas finds himself in a predicament. Being of mixed race, where would he go? In contrast to Split Me in Two, where the protagonist struggles with his mixed race identity, my mother offered another song on the topic of race for consideration, one that generated considerable debate amongst her family when it was released in Trinidad. No matter where you're born, you're still African, she would sing. It was an interesting statement, one that had our family in Brooklyn discussing its veracity. If an Indian born in England, he's an Indian man. Chinese born in Scotland, he's a Chinese man. So I think it's time that my black brothers try and understand. No matter where you're born, you're still African. I don't care where you're born, you're still African. You feel that's true? My mother would ask. Sofia Quintero writes that, quote, while some people read to escape, marginalized youth read to be affirmed. She continues saying that affirmation comes not from sanitizing their lives, but depicting the fullness of their humanity. Telling the truth about their issues, both personal and political, honors their resilience and sends the message that they too can thrive. Despite the socioeconomic challenges, they're already thriving. Similarly, I write to be affirmed and to provide affirmation for those who look like me and for those who have been marginalized in an education system that privileges whiteness. Writing ourselves into history means changing the narrative, returning some dignity to the lion. In a recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education titled Textbook Racism, How Scholars Sustain White Supremacy, the author writes that, quote, Webster of dictionary fame once told the black minister and abolitionist leader Amos G. Beeman that woolly-haired Africans have no history and there can be none, end quote. I'm instantly reminded of a time when facilitating a workshop with teachers where I did that prompt when I think of the Caribbean. This time I said, when I think of Caribbean politics, I think of, one lovely lady's response was, nothing. Do they have politics? Trinidad's own native son, V.S. Naipaul, once infamously stated, quote, history is built around achievement and creation, and nothing was created in the West Indies, end quote. If that could be said by one of Trinidad's most preeminent writers, then imagine the self-loathing that comes from those who are less recognized. On the one hand, we have those who will assert that Caribbean people have no history. But on the other hand, we have those who present a very skewed view of history, one that represents whatever it is that they need it to be. We saw this with Grandma, whose interpretation of the aftermath of slavery was very different than mine. Some may say she's not a scholar, so she's not cognizant of her biases. But historians are no different than other humans. They can be biased too. Even more so if they permit liberal underpinnings to delude themselves into believing that they are above the fray. I will never forget a conversation with a well-known Caribbeanist with no direct lineage to the Caribbean. I explained to him that music scholars need to broaden their scope in the region. When he asked how, I suggested, as a random example, that someone explore the influence of rock music in Trinidad. He scoffed at the idea, dismissively stating, all 5 of them, meaning 5 people playing rock music on the island. Fast forward nearly a decade later, when relating this subject to a group of 20-somethings in Trinidad, and they were amazed at the ignorance of this person, as the influence of rock on several musical groups is clearly evident. However, through my past experiences with this scholar, I know it is difficult for him to accept a Caribbean that he perceives as being too Western. As such, rock music in Trinidad would not fit into his romance of what it means to be Trinidadian, despite its clear influence. So what happens when such a scholar is tasked with advising graduate students and determining the types of topics that they should pursue? Dr. Eric Williams, Trinidad and Tobago's first prime minister, once stated that, quote, given its past history, the future way forward for the people of the Caribbean must be one which would impel them to start making their own history, to be subjects rather than the objects of history, end quote. East of Flatbush, north of Love is a testament to my belief in the importance of writing ourselves into history. As a musician, I chose to use song as the vehicle by which to tell my story. Other people might use different means. Somebody who's a chef might use food. Someone who's a scientist might use science. By writing ourselves into history, we guard against people telling us who we are. We guard against people trying to misinterpret history. We guard against those who would have us believe that our traditions are inferior. By writing ourselves into history, we dictate what's important to us. We dictate what aspects of our culture we value. By writing ourselves into history, we demonstrate that we are valuable. So as I close, I just want to remind you again, if you're not telling your own stories, someone else is telling them for you. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah.
I'm looking for my glasses. I'm taking this off.
Well, that was really fascinating, and just like you gave us so much material, things to think about. But I just wanted to say that I love your mom. I would love to meet her.
Try not to cough, laugh.
This is a question about kind of like gender and the role of women telling the stories.
Mm-hmm.
You are so focused on your mom, and I'm wondering. I don't want to go to ask you a personal question. What is your father in terms of telling the story, or your brother, or your uncle? I mean, how is it? Do you have the idea that this is kind of gender disoriented? Is this women are the ones in Trinidad who are telling the stories this way? I mean, how do you see gender playing a part in the way you've been collecting these stories? Or maybe it's because singing is something that women do and not necessarily men. I don't know. I'm just kind of like,
No, it's a good question, and I think sometimes when I do presentations it's a little bit skewed. I've actually had a couple of men tell me they want to hear more about my dad, because my dad he's in the book, but it happens that when I do my presentations, he's usually not. Usually cut him off, and I think it's a little bit more complicated. My dad, the largest chapter of the book is chapter 4 of God, Ghosts, and Obia. My dad is a minister. He wasn't always, but I forget how old I was when he became a pastor in a Pentecostal church. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with Pentecostal. It's evangelical, it's very strict. And so there's a whole lot to unpack there. I don't just talk about the Pentecostal, but I also talk about Neo-African traditions in Trinidad and other parts of the Caribbean. Interestingly, most of these calypsos are by men, right? So like men have dominated calypsos forever. So it's interesting when you bring that up in terms of the songs. I do see women as the ones who really pass down culture generally. Now I don't have any statistics or anything on that, but just generally speaking, I think mothers tend to pass down their traditions. Fathers do too, but if you need to know, for example, your family lineage, I would assume most times people would probably go to their mother. I could be wrong on that, but I think most times people will go to their mother. My mom knows more about my father's lineage than my dad does in terms of being able to say, oh, that person is da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So, but there is, I think I do need, at least in my presentations, to bring out a little bit more of the men. They're kind of to the wayside. My sister has told me my mom gets too much credit, so I have to watch that. I will say, and I didn't do this song today, but I do this song often, a song that my mother also used to sing very often called Jean and Dinah. So Jean and Dinah, Rosita and Clementina, round the corner posing. Bet your life is something they're selling. And if you catch them broken, you can get them all for nothing. Don't make a row. The Yankees gone and Sparrow take over now. So it's a song about prostitution that my mom was singing to me since I was like 5, right? But the song talks about the U.S. presence in Trinidad during World War II, which was, I don't know if you guys you should have probably done Lend-Lease laws with World War II. The British leased islands to the United States and bases, essentially. In Trinidad, Chaguaramas was a naval base, and it was leased to the United States for a period of 99 years. But Eric Williams, the first Prime Minister of Trinidad, ended that agreement early. But in the song, it's about prostitution, and Sparrow is basically saying the Yankees are gone now, you know, and so all of you women who used to make style, who thought you were too good for us, now you have to deal with us. There's the last verse of the song, he says, you know, no more hotel to rest your head, by the sweat of thy brow thou shalt eat bread, right? Which when you think about it in the constitution of prostitution and what's going on there, I mean, it almost sounds like it's a violation. I mean, you know, it's a job, but that's by the sweat of thy brow thou shalt eat bread. That's from the Bible, essentially after, you know, the fall from grace with Adam and Eve. You know, basically they're gonna have to work now. They were living in paradise, but now they have to work. And so one of the things that I'm always wonder about, there are other songs about that talk about, okay, Trinidadian men now, we're back, you know, with this prostitution thing. And I wonder, what about these women? I can't think of any songs from a woman's perspective, because again, men dominated calypso. So Jean and Dinah, Rosita, Clementina, what about these women? What would their response be in song? We don't have that, at least not that I know of, right? And so some of those gender dynamics, especially because I use so many calypsos, but they're still very male dominated. You know, they're coming from a male perspective, most of them. So that's kind of interesting, I think, in some ways, but yes?
I think for sorry, I was class, I just did a paper on
Mm-hmm.
right? And I was like, when I was doing my research on him, there is this overwhelming narrative that he just had a really, really great relationship with his masters, and it was who they taught him how to read. And if they weren't the ones who taught him how to read, like how else was he supposed to lead this very successful revolution? And one story they tell a lot is that when the revolts first happened, the first thing he did was actually go to his master's house and save them from the slave revolt. So, and it was just like overwhelming, and anywhere, like all the documentaries, like everywhere you looked, and I was like, there's something like off here. So I really I think that's very interesting to explore. As far as my question, that's just like on a side note.
No.
Yeah.
And before I forget, I don't know if you've read Silencing the Past by,
We will.
oh, I think it's probably one of the best books ever. But
Yeah, as far as the question, it seems like your mom at least was very proud of, and through her, just her oral history, it's almost seemed decolonized herself, and I can't, I'm Latinx, and now I'm getting older, I'm realizing that, my parents actually hate themselves, and, just the way the language that they use every single day, my mom and my dad will both say things where when I was younger, I would think, oh, I wouldn't think much of it because I was a kid, but now that or I'll hear my grandma say things where it's wow, you really
internalize.
Well, I've heard people in my family say oh, good thing the Spanish colonized us. Before that, we were all just dumb, and they were the ones who brought civilization to us. And I'm realizing this is a very, very pertinent thing in Latinx communities, and I've heard
deep.
also in the Caribbean to aspire to the colonizer and whiteness. And so I'm wondering what about Trinidad makes that I don't know if this is just your family thing, or do you think it's a thing in Trinidad to not necessarily have that attitude of
It's not. I mean, my mom is very proud of where she's from, but there are also things, for example, with my mom, I think all of these things are very complicated because there are ways in which people can be decolonized in some areas, but in other areas they're completely not. So when I was growing up, one of the things that my mom always used to tell me was speak proper English, and of course she grew up speaking the Queen's English. So, they always used to tell us that, as Yankee children, we don't, speak proper English. And I always remember telling her, there's no such thing as proper English. There's maybe standard English, but there's no such thing as proper English. And I used to say that from a young child. And what it is that the purpose of language is to be able to communicate, right? So however you do that, as long as you're doing that effectively, there's really no right or wrong with it. Now, there is standard, right? There's a standard that we'll have, so you'll say, okay, pretty much everyone who speaks, if they speak this way at home, they understand, they can come out here and they can speak this way and everybody can understand. So there can be a standard, but I reject this notion that it's proper English. And I heard that a lot in Trinidad. You'll still probably hear it, probably less so, but definitely with my mom's generation, you heard that a lot. And one of the things was, again, we were talking about survival strategies. I was talking with Dr. Soriano about this. My mother went to one of the top all-girls schools in Trinidad shortly after it was essentially desegregated. Prior to that, it was a school for the children of, Brits, essentially. And for her, I used to think my mom was a kind of snob when I was growing up, but I realized afterwards, she and her peers, they were going to a school, one of the top schools in Trinidad, at a time where they needed to show that as these third world young people, children, that they were just as capable or more capable than these British children. And that was just the reality. And so one of the ways to show that they were capable was beating the colonizer at their own game, being able to speak English more perfectly than the British, right? Now I'm in a generation where I'm kind of like, I'll throw in all kinds of green verbs. It's like it's just, I've got so much stuff in my brain, I can't even think about, is my verb the most proper one or what have you. But for them, that was crucial. That was important because this is a young nation, right? When my mom started that school, had they even reached? No, I guess they had reached independence. Trinidad won independence in 1962, right? So they were a young nation. And this is not just Trinidad. This is throughout Latin America and the Caribbean where there's this notion of really aspiring to be the colonizer to prove that you could be something, right? Now we're in a place where we're kind of moving away from that, but who's to say that maybe 10, 15, 20 years down the line, we might be looking at what we're doing now and saying, oh gosh, we were still really colonized, but seriously, you really don't know because at that time they were thinking they were progressing their people, right? So it's almost a catch-22. So I wouldn't say, I think my mom is very progressive, and I think in many ways, for example, I grew up with my mom saying, if parents don't speak English, they speak a language other than English, they should make sure that their children know that language. She wasn't one of those people who said, make sure your children don't learn that so they can learn English well and be able to speak English. She didn't subscribe to that. So there are ways that my mom was definitely on this, decolonizing trend, but there are other ways that, again, because she grew up with that, and for them that was the best solution to what they were facing at that time. I hope that answered your question. Okay.
You spoke about your decision to leave the academy, and I guess my question is, do you think that there's a place for people of color to learn in the academy? And the reason I ask this question is because I'm really beginning to think that, or the most radical thing I've learned in college is that actually the knowledge that my mom shared with me when I was a kid was really profound and is not something that should be sort of disregarded, or the knowledge that is shared amongst my peers of color or whatever. My parents are from Cartagena.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm wondering, and it's like something that's been really recent. Do you think that there's a way? You were talking about affirming knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
That you come to school to affirm knowledge. Is there? Do you think that there is a place for learning?
That's a hard question, and I think one of the things I think we don't do with well in academia, and especially, and just in general in life, is people doing whatever, finding their own calling. We're all kind of set up on this track that you do X, Y, and Z, and that's it. And you do this and you do that. I think there are, for some people, they'll be able to find a place where they can do that. I think sometimes it depends on the institution. Sometimes it depends on where you are in life, what stage of life you're in. I think there are just many factors. I don't know if there's one specific answer. I think it just varies. And I know that really wasn't an answer to your question, but I think, I don't know if I can actually give you a concrete answer. I think it, no, go, you have a follow-up.
What I found was so cool is that you're writing about this because you're coming back to this place where you realize, oh, there's so much to learn here, and this is where I actually need to be,
Well, I always knew there was a lot there.
Right.
And I think at one point I was hoping that I would be able to find it in the academy, but then when I got there, there really wasn't a place for me. But I think for some people, and again, I think it depends on the institution that you're at, I sometimes think that ethnic programs like Africana Studies, Latin American Caribbean Studies programs, those programs are sometimes places where you can do that. But again, I still think a lot of this knowledge needs to be not only contained within those kinds of programs. This should be general knowledge that people should be learning some of this stuff. You can't learn everything. There's just way too much to learn. But a lot of this information should be in textbooks in K through 12. So people should be learning this as just general knowledge, not specialized knowledge only for people who are doing work in Asian studies or Africana or Latin. Everybody needs to know it, because otherwise we're not going to really change anything. And so I wanted to get back to my reggae and jerk chicken before I forget. So the reason why I kind of smiled at you guys like that was because my sister gets angry with this all the time, because a lot of times people, when they think of the Caribbean, they think of, especially the English-speaking Caribbean, they think of Jamaica. And I remember one time having a friend in college, and she said, is Trinidad part of Jamaica? And I said, to her, I said, you're lucky you're with me. I said, but if you say it on the street, that might be fighting words for some people. But, people think about reggae. They'll think about jerk chicken. In steel pan, my sister gets frustrated because I think steel pan has become one of those, it's an instrument that's now just kind of associated with pan-Caribbean, but it's Trinidadian, and it's like Cuatro, the Venezuelan national instrument. It's the national instrument of Trinidad and Tobago. And and I like to talk about the steel pan because I think a lot of times when people hear steel pan, a lot of times it's during commercials for somewhere in the Caribbean, and people don't realize that history that's there, where the steel bands were horrible. I mean, they were considered horrible. And as the song said, if your daughter came and said she wanted to marry a pan man, family wanted to kick her out of the house. We're essentially like gangs, is what they were in many ways. And then but that's the image that they had, and it took a long time for them to be able to rise above that image. And one of the interesting things also about the steel pan, I can't go into a whole steel pan history here, is that the steel pan evolved. There was a ban on drumming in Trinidad in the 1800s. And there's bans on drumming throughout the Caribbean at various points in times. And out of that was developed the tambour bamboo, which Dr. Soriano just we were talking about. Different lengths of bamboo that are cut and they're pounded on the ground. So different lengths will give you different pitches, and they're pounded on the ground. And so when drumming was banned, that's what they used for percussion. And then out of that, the steel band was created. The rhythms that were used with the tambour bamboo were transferred onto the steel pan. But Trinidad has so much oil. It's an oil-rich country. I mean, essentially it was part of Venezuela. And there were a lot of oil drums that littered the island, especially during that World War II period. And that's how the instrument was formed. They started with biscuit tins, and then somebody would say, oh, I can get this note from there, and it just gradually, they started using the larger oil drums. But that's why I said that. So because, people from the Caribbean, they're proud, and it is a small region, but they like to know that people recognize them for their accomplishments, right? So people say steel pan, they want to know Trinidad. That's for Trinidadians, because, other people, they might not care so much, but Trinidadians want to know that, it's from Trinidad. But I just wanted to get back that. So next time you could say steel pan, you'll say Trinidad. Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah, and I was wondering about just the ways we identify ourselves, especially like through traditions.
Mm.
And you mentioned the two cases where like the split me in two, associating, with African roots, people of color should be, believing in that and promoting their African tradition. But for you, you're very proud, of course, of the Trinidadian tradition and your background in that area. And I was wondering, in what ways it's also generally Caribbean tradition, or even your Flatbush tradition, and what you think is how an important way of balancing those different parts of you.
This is a good question. I think with, there are many ways. Different people have different. Will answer this probably differently. And one of the things that I like to say with this book, right, and I talk about my experiences growing up, if my brother had written a book like this, it probably would read very differently, right? Because one, he's a boy, two, he's not me, and we have different experiences even though we grew up in the same household. My sister too. And so I'll answer this in saying that I don't really feel, I feel my identities are very, what's the word? I don't feel like I have a split identity in any way. I feel like they're all well integrated into who I am. But I was also talking to Dr. Soriano and saying that I think that's also specifically because I grew up in a Caribbean neighborhood. And you're right, there's a lot of Pan-Caribbean in my identity also. And I talk about that more in the book. So there's growing up as Trinidadian in my household specifically, and then also outside of the household too. But outside of the household where I grew up, it was a Pan-Caribbean, area. Even as, when I was, I remember as early as kindergarten talking with, my young peers about where we're from, and say, oh, my parents are from Trinidad, my parents are from Jamaica. And I had one friend who said, my parents are from Carriacou, and I said, there's no such place as Carriacou. And I argued him, to the point I think he was crying, and then I went home and my mom said, no, there is a place named Carriacou, and I was like, oh, But there's this kind of we recognize our individual and collective identities. Now, there are people who, like the story I was telling you, people who are who are Caribbean background but did not grow up in a Caribbean environment. And I find a lot of those people, not all, tend to have more of kind of this split identity. Because if they're growing up around, for example, mostly Black Americans, and there's no one whose culture kind of looks like theirs, they want to fit in with their peers. And so they might, again, not always, but I've noticed that tendency more in people who did not grow up in a specifically Caribbean neighborhood. So this. Yeah, you go ahead.
I don't know if about the Caribbean, but I would feel like that split, especially when when you grow up in a neighborhood that is oblivious to its history, its Black history, to its history, that is it could be even in the Caribbean, but if there's that ignorance of their history, of where they come from, no one's talking about it, then there's going to be a fragmentation.
With the identity.
Because no one's telling you where you came from, no one's speaking out, everyone's just being very discreet about all these things because there's been so many years of colonization that
people might try to hiding who they are.
And sometimes not even hide, sometimes just just being, they find it discreet because they learned it back then and they don't even know why it's unconscious.
Yeah.
And it passes on to the point that, you can see the difference, that you can see the mark, but if no one's speaking about it, no one's acting on it, everyone's just being dismissive and escaping it, then the fragmentation will come out.
There is that too. Although I think of that as less as kind of like fragmentation and more of kind of missing pieces in the story. As you said, there are people who things are passed on, but they don't really know the full story. And sometimes, again, a lot of that is because of colonization, sometimes they weren't able to express themselves freely because it was, you know, certain things were prohibited or whatnot. And I feel like those are people who have almost, as I say, this, you know, this kind of very cliche, like a hole in their soul. There's a piece that's missing.
But also, I feel, I don't know, at least for me, in personal history,
Mm-hmm.
it will be like more the mother.
Who would
Because my
pass
dad
on?
would speak, like,
Oh.
you know, freely. But my mom, like, unlike yours, not me.
You mean in terms of like kind of censoring and saying not to?
About speaking, how about, you know, like, just speak. Like, you know, like, your mother was a big influence on you,
Mhm.
you know? Which I think is very impressive because, yeah, you tend to crowd into their
Behavior.
And it is, you tend to do that. But when the mother is not speaking out, it's not encouraging.
But again, a lot of times, sometimes that's for, and I think you kind of allude to that, for protection. You know, at least when I think about the mothers who I know who haven't said certain things, a lot of times it's because of protection or sometimes not wanting to go back to certain stories that are, you know, I have friends who've said that, you know, their mother refuses to talk about certain things from where they were from, and a lot of that is because of the history of where they're from, and there was a lot of violence, a lot of military violence, there were just a lot of things, and some of it I told her, I said, it could be that she's blocking it out, or that specifically those memories she just does not want to share. And then other things are, it's interesting, but I think they're different, you know, you always kind of have to look at each individual situation and see then kind of what's going on, and then see what are the commonalities that they all share? Because I do think there are commonalities in terms of why that happens. I do.